Also something that now starts to define a greater number of the manifestos.
They also found the same thing for traumatic events. The greater number of traumatic events that you had.
And a greater number of potential candidates of character.
And what is it that we can do to expand them to a greater number of students?
Can actually be shared among a greater number of electronegative oxygens.
And rearrangements that cause a greater number of potential combinatorial sequences.
From a wider variety of situations, and so take in a greater number of interests.
We need to have a greater number of people involved in cybersecurity.
Stack a greater number of smaller loads within that.
Typically collect data in a greater number of bands.
It's at a much greater number of foreigners.
But then the greater number of people eat up that increase.
There's perhaps a greater number of genetic...
We're seeing a greater number of students that enter the university sector as...
They come from a greater number of sources around the world and a greater number of countries than ever before.
Allow us to search for even greater number of planets is to just block out.
Remember, there are the greater number of popsicles being sold. It does look like there is a greater number of people in New York City.
Greater quantity of speech, greater number of papers or readers or tweeters.
Actually pilot this to a much greater number of kids. So I would just be so excited.
With greater number of physicians being connected to the internet.
Where there are a greater number of people involved, but
hearing is going on to a greater number of sites. You saw a little bit.
Smaller interventions for a greater number of people with huge returns.
Social networking encourages people to have a greater number of much shallower friendships.
Inductance to sodium becomes larger because a greater number of sodium ion channels have opened.
Treat this situation in a greater number of patients.
There's going to be a far greater number of combinations of lattice.
In anticipation of a greater number of cases, but the residents of Washington State have done.
Two entities that have a greater number of attacks and a more...
And all opportunities to an ever greater number of people that we have become.
From increased land values for a greater number of people.
At time is characterized by a much greater number of international players.
Experience stress all increase with greater number of work interruptions.
To purchase and field a greater number of armored vehicles so that...
With good ideas of how a greater number of Detroiters can actually...
With a greater number of shelters and helplines available.
Seek to replace a greater number of the existing directors.
That's why there's a greater number of volunteers, people of faith.
Is a greater number of pupils for the design.
By referring patients to a greater number of services in primary care.
Based on the greater number of reduced impacts.
White turnout and want a greater number of Latino voters.
In the hardest hit, including sending a greater number of vaccines to rural health.
Police arrests of a greater number of males reflect sexism.
Why we have such a greater number of infections.
Urging classes or teaching in a bigger space, a greater number of students.
Associated with longer conflicts as the greater number of actors involved.
The impact that the much greater number of us down there would have.
We have a much greater number of applications.
See that there are a greater number of private beds that are available.
Unless there's a greater number of speakers, in which case it's...
We are able to provide that quality education to a greater number of people.
And learn from one another. As a greater number of countries have developed and built
a much greater number of corporate defaults than you.
Right when we're going to have a greater number of people travelling.
To go to the widening access point is that a greater number of both applicants and entrants from...
We would expect to see a much greater number of complaints and...
at schools across the country who've experienced a greater number of students deferring this.
More capital coming in, a greater number of founders.
Bibliotherapy represents a cost-effective means of potentially reaching a greater number of children suffering from it.
This mismatch of banks' ability to underwrite a far greater number of loans than they could feasibly